Many vintage computing enthusiasts find tiny laptops to be really compelling. The problem is that they're often a pain to work on. Toshiba's Libretto series is no exception, and while this one had a very simple problem, its solution ended up being a bit more convoluted than one would expect. As the late 90s saw a dramatic increase in laptop popularity, manufacturers offered a wide variety of models to hit different price points and use cases. One was that of the so-called road warrior, frequent business travelers who wanted small, lightweight computers to keep their luggage manageable. A number of PC makers sought to serve this niche market, but one of the most iconic ended up being the Libretto series from Toshiba. These machines weren't just slimmed down mainstream models, they were outright tiny, about the size of a paperback book. When the 50CT debuted in mid-1997, magazines generally reviewed it favorably, though it has some obvious caveats. The 6.1-inch screen is clear and bright, but limited to 640 by 480 resolution, and the Libretto's footprint meant its keyboard needed to be far smaller than standard size, so you wouldn't want to do much typing on it. Controlling the pointer was another problem. Toshiba couldn't squeeze its acupoint into the keyboard like it did with its larger machines, so it came up with the creative solution of putting it on the screen bezel. It works well enough, but feels pretty unnatural, and you're out of luck if you're left-handed. Though I was surprised to find that this machine happened to include spare nubbins. Not that it needs one, as this thing is showing practically no signs of wear. Maybe that's not surprising, as few would have been likely to use these as their main PC. Contributing to that is the lack of ports. The 50CT only has the power input and PC card slot on the right side, with a 2.5mm headphone jack and infrared port on the back. To connect anything else would require one of two docking stations. The smaller one, which was included with this machine, connects to the bottom of the Libretto and adds parallel, VGA, and serial ports. A larger one could be had and added PS2 ports for mouse and keyboard, along with a second PC card slot. Besides omitting really any on-board ports, the other limitation with the 50CT is that it was hamstrung with technology that was a bit behind the times. It came with a 75MHz Pentium CPU, 16MB of RAM, and an 815MB hard drive. And that drive is giving me problems I need to deal with. The computer powers on but gets hung up during the boot process because the drive keeps spinning up and down. It's clearly gone bad, so I needed to arrange a replacement. One might expect a machine of this size to be a nightmare to take apart, but surprisingly, Toshiba made the drive easily accessible through a slot on the left side. Unsurprisingly, it's a Toshiba branded drive, and while I could drop another mechanical one in here, I think this is a good candidate for a solid-state alternative. This laptop actually belongs to Free Geek Twin Cities, a non-profit based in Minneapolis that focuses on technology, reuse, and recycling. They had included this compact flash adapter and a handful of cards for me when I agreed to help get the Libretto running again, and these are certainly a popular and inexpensive option for machines from this era. I would just need to come up with a mounting bracket of some sort, since the adapter is smaller than a typical drive. 3D printing to the rescue. I found a bracket someone else had designed specifically for this adapter. But it wouldn't work as is. Toshiba had gone with 7mm thick drives in the Libretto, which were fairly new at the time, while most other laptops used ones that were either 9.5 or 12.5mm. This bracket was the latter, so it simply wouldn't fit in the drive bay. It was also missing holes on the end where the little metal strap that secured the drive would screw into. I tweaked the design and printed out a new one. Not only was it shorter so it would actually fit in the machine, I added the missing screw holes and also included a little cutout to accommodate these solder joints on the bottom of the CF adapter. I used some strong VHB double-sided tape to secure the adapter to the bracket, but found I couldn't get it to connect to the pins inside the laptop. Turns out the adapter was sitting too low in the bracket. An easy fix was to simply add another layer of tape between the adapter and bracket, and that got the pins to line up perfectly. But it also caused a new problem in that these jumper headers were now sticking up above the bracket and keeping it from sliding into the Libretto. I didn't really need these headers, so I decided to desolder them and just bridge the connection on the PCB. So that got the hardware sorted, but how would I get Windows 95 reinstalled on this thing? The laptop included its external floppy drive, which connects through a PC card. There being only one card slot meant I couldn't also hook up an external CD-ROM drive, but it's also unlikely the Libretto can boot from one of those, and the majority of Windows 95 CDs weren't bootable themselves anyway. Back when this machine was new, owners would have accomplished this task by using a stack of floppy disks. Yes, Windows 95 was offered on floppies as well, all 19 of them if you include the Internet Explorer installer. These disks are actually pretty interesting in that they use a setup called DMF, or Distribution Media Format. In short, they're normal disks that have been formatted for 21 sectors per track instead of 18, which allow them to store 1.68 megabytes of data each, up from the normal 1.44. Some claim that this was to prevent piracy, as it can be difficult to make copies of them, but Microsoft employee Raymond Chen explained in a blog post that it was simply a cost-cutting measure to reduce the number of disks needed. Chen's blog is worth reading, as there's other fun stories about the development of Windows 95, including one where, in order to confirm compatibility with existing applications, a colleague drove to the nearest Egghead software store and bought one copy of every program on the shelves so that they could be tested. I'll include a link in the description. Installing from that many floppies is tedious, and this edition of Windows 95 cut out a number of extra components from the CD version anyway. The best option was to copy the installer files to the CF card using another computer, a trick that's come in handy for me plenty of times before. In fact, my ThinkPad 390E is set up with the same kind of CF card adapter, and while it isn't flashy, this machine sure is useful since it has floppy and CD drives built in. The next consideration was which CF card to choose. Capacity was a concern. I'd want to go with something at least as large as the original drive, so I weeded out anything less than a gigabyte in size. Next up was whether the card would be compatible. Compact Flash is based on IDE, which is how these adapters are so simple and cheap. But most cards can't be used as a bootable volume, as tools like FDisk will refuse to even detect them. This is because they're configured as removable devices, which makes sense for use with things like digital cameras, but not as hard drive replacements. The trick is to use cards that are set up in fixed disk mode, but finding those isn't as easy as it should be. Of the cards I tried, these ones from Kingston, S-Tech, and Transcend came up as fixed, while the pair of SanDisk cards were set as removable. In some cases, you can convert a SanDisk card between modes using a DOS utility, such as with this 2GB Ultra 2 drive I use in the ThinkPad. But neither of the other two cards worked, and to frustrate matters further, there doesn't seem to be a published list of cards that the utility is compatible with. So it's difficult to recommend SanDisk cards for this purpose, unless you have a wide variety at your disposal and the free time to test them. Traditionally, compact flash cards sold for industrial use are the best choice, but even then, there can be some variability. Transcend says its industrial cards are set as fixed, but I came across an Amazon review from 2022 where the buyer got one that was set as removable. Though, curiously, they were able to use the DOS utility to successfully change it, which I had previously thought only worked with SanDisk cards. I've also read that some cards will dynamically change whether they're fixed or removable depending on the device they're plugged into, but haven't found any firm evidence of that. Ultimately, if you want to avoid all this mess, maybe spending the extra money on an adapter for SD cards or a dedicated IDE SSD is the better move. But I got one of the cards formatted in the ThinkPad and dropped in the Windows 95 CD. An old school trick I love to use is to create a special set of folders on the target hard drive, then copy the Windows setup files from the CD into them. I also burned the drivers for the 50CT to disk and copied those over to the CF card as well. Some have had luck using a USB to IDE adapter or card reader to copy files using a modern PC, but I prefer to use period hardware and F-disk to guarantee the setup runs smoothly. Either way, it was then just a matter of moving the card into the Libretto and booting it from a Windows 95 floppy. Because the setup files were already on the drive, I could skip the whole conundrum with needing a floppy and CD-ROM drive at the same time. Plus, installing Windows this way tends to go much quicker. Windows 98 would arguably be a better OS to install on here, but I went with 95 for two reasons. First, it's period accurate for the hardware, and second, the Libretto's 16 megabytes of RAM is a bit of a limiting factor. RAM upgrades did exist, but they're proprietary and don't come up for sale very often. I got the drivers installed in some optional packages like the additional Windows sounds. This is another area where saving the setup files to the hard drive is helpful so you don't have to dig out the CD. And interestingly, for as many shortcomings as the 50CT has, sound isn't one of them. I previously had a short bit of time with one of these machines, and I demonstrated its MIDI playback capabilities. I won't spoil it, but if you want to hear what it sounds like, be sure to go check out that episode. One might be inclined to think that the 50CT was a one-off product, but it's actually one of a series of Libretto models that utilize this form factor. In late 1997, Toshiba launched the 70CT, which otherwise looked the same but upgraded the CPU to a 120 MHz Pentium and a 1.6 GB hard drive. And after that came the 100 and 110 models, which saw the display grow to 7.1 inches and include even faster CPUs, more RAM, and bigger drives. Of course, these machines never flew off the shelves, hence their scarcity today, though they weren't horribly priced when new. The 50CT sold for about $2,000 US. That was in line with other more mainstream laptops, so it really just came down to what features you were after. Most people wanted big screens, comfortable keyboards, and all the other trappings that make a computer usable every day. But for those road warriors where portability was paramount, the Toshiba Libretto series was certainly built to impress. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Here's another video you may want to check out, and as always, thanks for watching.